Checking connection, ... I'm live. And you're live.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today with our live stream and our Q&A with Adrian Cox. I'm Sherry Trahan. I'm the director of the Corey Helford Gallery, and we are really excited to be exhibiting Adrian's new exhibition, The Brush and the Torch. This is his fourth solo show at the gallery and his largest one to date, featuring 25 brand new works. Adrian said that this exhibition could be viewed without any further context. However, it can also be positioned within the mythology that he's created over the course of his career. We want to hear Adrian's mythology. We love it. It's very complex and it really goes into detail with the world of all these paintings. You're going to enjoy that. In creating his work, Adrian draws inspiration from art history, science fiction, mythic archetypes, and his own experience growing up in a closeted queer family. He's exhibited his work nationally and abroad, plus his paintings have been featured by Vice, Juxtaposed, Beautiful Bazaar, High Fructose, Heavy Metal Magazine, Prohibited, and in the book Anatomy, Rocks, Flesh, and Bones in Contemporary Art. I have to read this because there's so many fantastic things he's done. I knew I wouldn't be able to remember all of them. Adrian has said that every second of his life feeds into his creative process, which you'll learn much more about today. And now, let me introduce you to the artist and your host for today's walkthrough, Mr. Adrian Cox.
Hello, and thank you to everyone who is tuning in through Instagram Live, and to those of you that have come in person. This exhibition has been immensely rewarding to work on, and truly is a body of work that I'm proud to present. So, speaking about this exhibition, I'm going to go a little bit more for a sense of depth on these works than breadth. So I won't be able to hit every single painting in this exhibition. It's a very large show, and I want to speak about these works quite deeply. So I encourage you, if you have not had the chance to look at this exhibition online, to view it online, and if you're here in person, after I'm done speaking, hearing what I have to say, please, by all means, take a slower walkthrough of the exhibition than we're going to do today. So, without further ado, I'll go ahead and kick things off. So, I decided to begin with this painting here, which is called Spirit Gardener Calling the Lost Spectral Witnesses. I love this as an entry point to this exhibition. There's a sense of, with this character on the right here, Spirit Gardener, blowing the horn, there's an invitation to this exhibition, and an invitation to the kind of world that I'm building here. All of my works are tied together by a mythology that I've been building for years. So rather than viewing each of these works as completely separate sets of symbols and ideas where I'm bringing a fresh kind of disconnected thought to each painting that I make, all of these are part of a larger network of symbols that form a greater whole. So in all of these exhibitions that I mount, I explore this world that I call the Borderlands and these recurring characters that inhabit it. So I guess I'll launch right into speaking a little bit about some of the characters that inhabit my work. In this painting right here, you can see two kinds of the beings that inhabit the Borderlands. On the right, we have Spirit Gardener. Spirit Gardener is a border creature. The border creatures are the protagonists of my work. They are peaceful, gentle beings. They're artists, they're mystics, they're scientists. They have this relationship with the natural world where rather than being separated from it, rather than being isolated from it, they serve as the kind of extension of the natural world they inhabit. They are the spiritual heart of the landscape. So on the left, you will see these rainbow glowing figures, and they recur throughout the exhibition. These are the spectral witnesses. The spectral witnesses are reformed specters. So that brings me to the third being. The specters, which are not present in this painting, they're glowing blue beings that are kind of the anti-border creature. They're the antagonists of the work. So rather than being embedded in the landscape, they have a sense of isolation, of alienation. Rather than cultivating the landscape as a garden, they tend to destroy the world that they walk through. The spectral witnesses here are specters that have been shaken from their path that they were walking. They're not completely redeemed, but they're seeking a new way of being in the world. So in this work, we see the border creature, spirit gardener, making a call to these lost spectral witnesses, a kind of spiritual calling to progression, to following the path, to continuing to seek, which I thought was a lovely way to introduce the exhibition and introduce some of how I'm going to explore this world throughout the show. So as I move through this, before I move to the next paintings, I always want to stop and check if there are questions. If not, I'll move on to the next thing. But does anyone have any questions before I move on?
Were your settings inspired by?
So if anyone on live couldn't hear, the question was, where are my settings inspired by? That is actually something that I'm constantly collecting wherever I travel. I have a vast library of images that I've taken. They're usually fragments of landscape. I tend not to photograph or document huge vistas, already bucolic vistas. I tend to gather images of foliage, scraps of pictures of boulders and moss and tree trunks, something that gives me a sense of the texture of the landscape. The landscapes that I tend to photograph, well, of course, since moving out to California about, I guess, 5.5 years ago, I've documented more California landscapes. This one was based on a landscape that I photographed outside of Redding, California, when I was visiting my brother. And of course, you know, the process that I take these images through, the process that I use to translate these landscapes that I'm creating, there's a great bit of departure from what I'm looking at. So the sense of purely natural realism tends to get lost, and that's fully intentional. I want to create this kind of hyper-real, hyper-lush landscape. So you'll see scraps of California, you'll see scraps of the Midwest, where I lived for a while. I'm originally from the Southeast. You'll see marshes from the Southeast. So it's something where I'm taking landscape in, filtering it through myself, and constructing these images out of those, if that answers your question. Any others before I move on to the next one?
Sorry, so
Oh, yeah.
in this particular painting, there is no trace of the specters, right? Like the destroyers?
No. Let's see, the specter in this room is that small round painting over here. So, so these beings, if you see them throughout the show, the glowing blue figures, they're usually holding a torch. Sometimes they're holding axes, sometimes they're holding swords. Real friendly looking characters. These are these specters. So in this work, real small on the horizon, you can see some lost spectral witnesses watching the specter who's just set a fire and is riding in their boat as kind of this raiding force. But again, a lot of my works, there's a balance of destructive and creative forces. So again, we have an image here that on its surface feels like a pretty, villainous action, the setting of a fire. But at the same time, in the background, we have the implication of the redemption, the possible path to redemption. So no character in my work is outright condemned, I think. There's always a path forward. Okay, I think I'm going to move on to the next one.
Okay.
So I think this would be a great point to move to this image, which is the spectral king enthroned. So there's a lot of symbolism to talk about in this one, but before I actually dig into the meat of the image, I would like to address a little bit about how I talk about what these works mean, about how the narrative plays out, and what I mean when I say that I'm using symbols. So I think the distinction that I'd like to draw to try and discuss this would be the difference between saying that I'm using something as a sign versus saying that I'm using something as a symbol. So when I say something is a sign, it means that there's a one-to-one relationship in meaning. When you see a stop sign, you know that it means stop. Allegory tends to treat images and paintings as signs. So this represents that, this represents that, there is a correct answer. That's not how I'm working, that's not how I think about my work. I think through symbols, and when I say symbol, I mean that what is indicated by the image is something invisible and not necessarily easy to communicate, or even possible to communicate with rational, logical, discursive conversation, right? So anytime you talk about the meaning of a work of art, the meaning of a symbol, you can only ever approach it indirectly, because one explanation for a thing never exhausts the full meaning of the thing, right? This is why we can have so many interpretations of a single novel. So, you know, I think this even goes back to the etymology of the word symbol, right? The Greek root of symbol is sin and bol, which is thrown together. So in the ancient Greek world, this meant that you'd have a coin or a token that was broken in half and given to two people, and it would be used to verify identity. So only when the two halves came together would you have the full thing. So in this etymology of the word, there's even this implication that if you're viewing half the coin, that the other side is invisible. So a symbol speaks to something that is invisible. I think another kind of bit of information that I find pertinent to this conversation would be bringing in, I'd say, like Joseph Campbell's definition of myth, right? That myth is a metaphor that's transparent to transcendence. So when he says that, he's talking about myth and story, but I think this is a great way to talk about art in general as well. So to explain what he means by that, I want you to picture a house with no windows and no doors in a huge, vast, beautiful landscape. You knock down part of a wall, you put a window there. That's a myth, that's a work of art. You can view the landscape through it, right? You can't confuse the myth or the work of art itself for the meaning of the symbol, right? It hints at something that is beyond it, that is hidden, right? So all of these symbols that I'm talking about, I don't want to imply that there is an exhausted explanation of the works when I tell you the way that I think about them. So there's always room for interpretation. There's always room for bringing in new perspectives on these works. So that side quest aside, moving right into the imagery of this work. This is a great point to talk about the title of the exhibition, The Brush and the Torch. Another way of framing this would be creativity and its shadow. This is the spectral king. He is the leader of the specters. I envision him as the shadow of the artist, the shadow of creativity. That's to say that he represents this kind of tyranny of the will, this sense of the ego reveling in its ability to reshape the world around it, right? So in that sense, it's not necessarily that the shadow of creativity is the absence of creativity, but it's kind of a negative creativity. So here the king is enthroned on a stump that he's cut. He's holding a torch. This pose is based on the King of Wands from the Marseille tarot deck, which is a Renaissance tarot deck that were really like archaic images that I found really, really compelling when I was working on this show, and started bringing in images from that deck in conversation with some of the art historical references that I've made. So typically when I paint the spectral king, he's put in conversation with archetypes of heroes. I put him in poses reminiscent of Hercules quite frequently, but in this one, he's the King of Wands. He's this image of dark creativity. Now, in the bottom left here, squirreled away, we have a little salamander and a little brush. The way I thought about this is that the spectral king is never banished, right? He's never put away and said, oh, well, now I've got the good creativity. It's only ever something that's actively pushed against until an equilibrium is found as a creative. So that's kind of an abstract way of talking about it, but ultimately within the plot of my work, so much as there is one, he is the leader of the antagonists. He is the leader of the specters. So that was a lot. So I'll pause here and field questions if anyone has them, either on Instagram or for those of you in person. Anyone have any questions before I move on?
Lots of heart emojis.
Lots of
Lots of fire emojis.
Okay, great. I think this would be a good point to move on. And again, I'm not going to be moving through this show in a linear way. I'll be bouncing back and forth through works. And I'll hit on as many paintings as I can, but I'll leave room at the very end for more questions, and we'll see how much time we have. So let's walk all the way back to the back of the gallery. So this painting, it's called Painter's Tower, and this is the first in a three-part narrative cycle that kind of forms the central thematic column of the show. Everything else spins out from these three works. But before I talk about the imagery in this, before I talk more about the symbolism, I want to talk a little bit about process, because people are always curious about that. I have a very particular way of working. I could be said have an obsessive way of working, but I'm happy to share as much of that as people want to know. So I'll kind of run through how I planned for this image and then made it, and then I'll talk about the image. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this work. So beginning with a sketch, I tend to percolate ideas in a way where I don't necessarily know what a work means when I begin it. I try to find the meaning through the process of creating a study at the very least, and then sometimes meaning will continue unfolding as I create the work. I have a notion going in of a field of inquiry, I guess. I have a notion going in, but I don't have a set idea that I'm executing, right? I'm not illustrating a thought that I have. So beginning with the sketch, I kind of mapped this out based on a narrative thought of what happens when this character painter, one of the border creatures, has a studio invaded by the specters and wrecked, right? A simple narrative kind of set up. And then from there, meaning spun out. So with this process, I have a mix of photographic collage, digital work with a tablet and Photoshop, and actual physical sculpture, and even shadow box sculpture that I made with cut paper. So everything in this is fairly non-linear in how I created it. For this exhibition, I actually tried to make my process less linear. I tried to throw wrenches into the works that would slow me down, would make me swerve in directions I didn't expect. All of this to try and find meaning and connections that I might not otherwise find. So the sculpture is the figure themselves. This is Painter. I have a sculpture of Painter in my studio. All of my sculptures are usually a head that is sculpted separate, and it's just on a metal pole in my studio. And then I have a body that's usually a wire sculpture covered in material. These sculptures are a mix of fake flowers, fake fruit, wax, clay, crystals sometimes, acrylic paint, gel mediums. It's very slapdash. It's like physical collage. But they give me a basis for these very complex characters that need to be at least a little consistent work to work, because they're recurring characters, right? So I'm making this mythology, which means there needs to be a level of consistency. When I paint Painter, he needs to look like Painter. So I have a sculpture of him. When I move from the drawing to the study that I make for a painting, I will do the pose myself, take a photograph of that and light it. I will photograph from many angles with colored lights the maquette, the sculpture that I've made, and then I will use Photoshop to collage that together. So that's how I got the figure. The abstract painting behind the figure, which is an abstraction of this rook chess piece, that actually, I don't, obviously I'm not an abstract painter, so trying to force myself to use a language other than my own, right? Trying to make myself paint like Painter instead of like Adrian Cox. I had to, I had to kind of find a new way of thinking visually. So I created this collage of cut paper. This was the first of them that I made, and based on this chess piece, so you can kind of see the silhouette of it out from there. And then as far as this tablecloth, that's actually a printed image of an old painting that I made from 2020, The Origin of the Spectres Part 2, that I folded and draped over a table that I made out of cardboard and hot glue. And then the rest of this is a mix of Photoshop work and collages of images that I've taken. When I build an image up, the process that I use is glazing. So it's a fairly traditional painting technique. However, the way that I work with it, I'm using mediums that are new and synthetic. I'm using paint pigment that is new and synthetic. So it's using the logic of a very old process in a very new way, well, newish. But ultimately, the luminosity that you'll see in my paintings, that glow, is because I'm building things up in a transparent way. So when you look at the surface of one of my paintings, I think even in this abstract painting, which is fairly flat intentionally, you'll still see depth of transparency, where a lot of the light in this is actually just the white of the panel itself that I painted with acrylic gesso. So when I layer transparent pigment, the light is passing through those layers and then bouncing back, rather than just hitting a flat surface and bouncing immediately back, which creates a different optical effect, right? So that's a little bit about the process. Before I move into the symbolism and the narrative stuff that leads into the rest of this series, does anyone have questions about my process based on what I've said?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your process of building up that glow?
In which part?
Like in all the
Yeah. So what I'll say is that glazing for me is not necessarily a formula of more transparent is always better. This is very technical and in the weeds, and this is a question asked by another skilled painter. So, this is something where I'm going to get a little bit technical here. But when I'm working with glazing, the question that I'm asking myself is, what have I laid underneath, and how much am I trying to cover it up? So when I go full transparent, it's like, laying down a layer of glass. It changes the color of the thing, but and it's very, very luminous, but it tends to draw the eye immediately. So I tend to work with a lot of semi-opaque and semi-transparent layers. So they're not necessarily always fully transparent. So in here is a great example, and in here is a great example where you can see this kind of, when you get up close, this kind of choppiness of scumbling, which is essentially taking a little bit of paint and rubbing it on thinly. You can see that understructure showing through. So in this one, I laid down probably, I believe it was like a hot, transparent orange underpainting. It had like a little bit of earth tones in it, but it was pretty hot and reddish. And then I mixed up this blue-gray. And a lot of times these mixtures that appear as gray or blue-gray, they're actually more brightly colored than you would expect. Because when you lay them on transparently, this is particularly true of snow scenes that I paint. They often have very highly saturated underpaintings. But when you lay it on transparently and that color shines through, it makes that color that you've mixed, that blue or that gray, appear more neutral, right? Which is to say more gray than it would, if that makes sense. And I tend to try and make light sources the most transparent areas of the painting. And then honestly, I get playful with it. There's no strict formula to how I work. I pay attention to how I layer, but other than that, there's a lot of responding to instinct in how I build these things up. And of course, I encourage you, if you're curious about process, I've got lots of images in my archive and my Instagram. I encourage you to go look at that. Anything else? Okay, I'm going to dive right into the imagery, and I'll try not to stay too long on this painting because there are other works I want to talk about. So Painter's Tower is, again, recalling what I said about the title of the show. the brush and the torch, creativity and its shadow. Keep that in mind moving through this three-part narrative cycle. This is the image of Painter, who is kind of my analog in this world. It's not a direct, Painter is not me, but he is a way to speak about my craft as a painter and my world as a creative person. So it's a way to maybe archetypally speak about things related to my craft as an artist. So this is, I was thinking about again, from the Tarot de Marseille deck, the image of the tower for this one. So on one level, there's this very simple narrative thing, which is he's looking at a rook, and he's making an abstraction of that rook behind him. The broader symbolic implication here is that the studio is a kind of tower. The tower is this structure that closes Painter off from the world around them. You can see walls being constructed that's blocking off their line of sight from this lush, beautiful landscape, to the extent that Painter is oblivious to the approaching danger of these specters riding in to completely wreck his day. So this is an image of creativity where, rather than enriching the experience of one's life, rather than being connected to the way that one lives, it can also become an isolating force, a force that becomes cut off from what I view as one of the big sources of creativity, the deep well springs of creativity, which is life and being. So this image of the studio as a closed circuit in which nothing new can enter is reinforced by this little snake at the bottom, hidden in the corner. So this is a little blue garter snake biting its tail. So this image of the Ouroboros is, of course this image has deep historical meaning as a symbol. But as I'm employing it here in conversation with the other images that I've thrown into this work, I was thinking about it as an image of a closed circuit, like I said, so reinforcing the sense of the tower. So you can look at the snake as we move through the other two pieces in this three-part narrative cycle and see the transformation of the snake as a mirror of what's happening symbolically in the work. Any questions before I move to the next work? I know I've spoken about this one. Okay, so.
I was going to ask what the characters are, right?
Okay, so this is actually Painter, 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 and Painter, and that's Snake Gardener. Snake Gardener shows up at the end of this three-part narrative cycle as well. Snake Gardener is a scientist, and she is Painter's lover. But again, when I speak about this walling off of the outside world through the creative process, it's a hall of mirrors, essentially. And that's even reinforced in an abstract painting. Painter can't even escape themselves when they're making an abstract work because the light is projecting this double of themselves. The shadow becomes this image of Painter literally trapped within the structure, the silhouette of the tower, right? So yeah, creativity is this kind of hall of mirrors and closed space. And we're going to see that start to open up as Painter undergoes this initiatory trauma that we'll experience in the second work. Yeah.
Is that a torch leaning up against the table?
This is a maul stick. That is one of the tools I use in my studio. It is basically the end that's wrapped in cloth and cushioned. You rest it against a work so that you can put your hand against the stick and stabilize your hand without damaging the surface of the work. It's a traditional painter tool. Anything else? Okay, let's move on to Painter's Judgment. So as we saw in Painter's Tower, there were specters that were riding in boats coming to invade the studio. In this one, Painter's Judgment, the invasion is well underway. Painter is having their studio completely wrecked and turned upside down. But again, this image, which could be on its surface read as this violent or traumatic image, it's an image of spiritual transformation. So the subtext of this work for me is immensely positive. This is an image of liberation of a sort. So what we have here is painter hung upside down from their easel. This is a specter that's pulling the rope that's raising them up. We have the spectral king, who we met earlier in the show, holding a torch high overhead and about to bind painter's hands. Carved on, so the spectral king is, within the lore of my work, created from white clay. So oftentimes you'll see carvings in their flesh. This is something where the specters can carve emblems, symbols into the flesh, wipe it clean, start over again. This painting also reveals something pretty key about the nature of the spectral king, which is that the king is not innately powerful because of who they are, who they were born to be. The king is a suit, it's a mantle of power. So in the images the painter is producing, right, from this experience as they're being hung upside down, we see two key images of the king. We see the king as Hercules here. This pose in this work, which is also hung next to it, it's a gouache painting. So this image is based on a pose of Hercules by Annibale Carracci, a Baroque Italian painter. Behind this image of the king as Hercules leaning on the axe instead of the club that Hercules typically has, we have a specter seated on a throne of, again, a chopped tree, holding up a skin with the emblem of the king carved into the forehead. So this empty suit, that is the spectral king, right? So the implication here is that, yes, putting on this mantle of power does create the sense of, as I said, this tyranny of the will, this ability for whoever's wearing the suit to envision a different world and then bring it about. But that power is not deep power. It is something that is taken off and put on. So, implicit in this is that what painter is experiencing through this moment of vulnerability and surrender is actually closer to the deep wellspring of creativity that will allow something of a more grounded and connected variety to arise out of the creative process. Here we have the repetition of the snake as a symbol. So if you remember in the last work, we had the snake as the Ouroboros biting its tail, closed circuit. Here, it's released its tail and it's shed its skin. What's left behind is a spiral. So the closed circle has become a spiral. The spiral, a shape that is open, in which something new can enter. And also the snake in this moment of transformation, shedding its skin. So again, I think of this work as an image of liberation through difficult process. In a sense, this is sometimes what studio work feels like. I think that would be a good point to field a question if anyone has any about this work.
Do the moon phases mean anything, like, as far as the symbolism goes along? Because I think there was like a different moon phase over here in this one.
I will sometimes try to use moon phases to basically track time in a show. So sometimes weather and moons will be a way to signify that something might be happening at the same time as something else. But that's not a hard rule. Sometimes I use it aesthetically. A full moon is a great light source. But again, the full moon, the waxing, waning moon, like the moon is a symbol of transformation, is also a powerful symbol. But in this work, I wasn't thinking about it necessarily, the moon itself as an element in the symbolism.
And the carvings that he has, does he do the carvings himself, or is it done by other people, the other specters?
I haven't depicted that yet, so I won't give a firm answer until it actually makes its way into a painting, because honestly, the way that I think through these narrative things is if I haven't painted it and I don't see it, I don't necessarily always know the answer. I like to keep mysteries for myself. in the world of the Borderlands, so that when I'm exploring it, I get to discover new things. So what I know about the carvings in the king's chest is sometimes they're carved by other specters. When he was enthroned, or when he was crowned, his first moment of donning this mantle of power, there was a ritualistic carving of signs and symbols and words into the skin by other specters. In this case, I don't know, he might have carved that himself. But that torch, the upside down torch, you know, that's another element of this that I didn't quite talk about is the painter is upside down and is caught between reaching for this image of a torch and the work, right? So there is this implication that while the king is something that needs to be sublimated, right, to be integrated into one's life, it can't control everything. But there is this sense that tyranny of the ego can't ultimately be dispelled or destroyed, right? The ego is always going to be there in the creative process, but it needs to be brought into a more constructive way. Anything else?
Sketch.
What's that?
The sketch.
Oh, yeah, so I forgot to mention this sketch right here. That is a sketch for the spectral king enthroned, which we spoke about at the beginning of this walkthrough. So you'll find through this exhibition, through any of my exhibitions, that there are a lot of connections between works within a show. I like to create a sense of a shared world and symbols that speak to each other. But then also you'll find connections that I'm drawing to works that are not in this show, to works that I made years ago. So I like to think about everything that I make as part of this shared world and network of symbols that kind of enrich each other by how they're played off of each other. Anything else before we move to the next one? Okay, great.
Thank you, guys.
All right, so here we have the conclusion to this three-part cycle. This painting is called Painter's Star, and in this work you can see the passage of time. We've moved from twilight to full night to dawn in this one. So this has all taken place over the course of an evening to a sunrise. So in this moment, we see Painter has survived this ordeal. The studio has been destroyed. These are all old paintings of mine in the back here. This is actually the first, leaning at an angle here, is the first border creature that I ever painted. But the studio is in shambles, but Painter is okay. And Snake Gardener has come and is saving them and is pouring water over Painter's wounds and cutting his bonds. This is an image of, well, I guess the way to speak about this would be to maybe use the snake as the next point. So we've seen the snake close circuit, Painter's tower, opening into the spiral, shedding its skin, Painter's judgment, that transformation. And here the snake is forming a bond between two figures. So the snake, which has been associated with Painter thus far, is now associated with Snake Gardener, with a connection. So this is an image of the creative process being enriched by life, by the connections to those that inhabit your life. It's not an isolating process, it's not an alienating process. It is fed by living and by connecting. And we can see this because the portal that opens up behind Snake Gardener, that's Painter's portal. Painter is gazing into this space that is opening up behind their lover. And it is, well, I guess a great way to talk about these portals that you'll see throughout this exhibition would be to circle back to what I said about Joseph Campbell's definition of mythology, right? A metaphor that is transparent to transcendence. So that idea of a window that opens up onto a vast landscape, right? So a work of art does that, right? It makes the world a little bit bigger, a little bit richer. These windows, these portals, they're not escape hatches. They're not a means by which you step through and you're outside of reality. They are a window that allows you to glimpse exactly how big reality is. And you tend to only get that when you engage deeply with both the creative process and with life. right? The creative process has to be connected to that process of life, that vulnerability, that surrender, right? That strength and that ego and that walling off of yourself isn't, that is an impediment. That is the shadow of creativity. So yeah, and I think I've had a couple people be like, oh no, you're burning your works, and again, I think burning the image of the work is a different thing. I am proud of my body of work that I made this work. But I think when you think about a creative process that is open to what is new, that is open to what is radically new, you can't wall yourself off with previous accomplishments either. So there is something cathartic in the spectral king coming and burning everything to the ground, right? It's an opportunity to start with something that we've never seen before, this portal into this world, which, again, as I'm layering these art historical images, that last painting, Painter's Judgment, that was the pose, and that one was based off of a martyrdom painting by Guido Reni. At the same time, it's drawing images from the Tarot de Marseille. In this one, again, we have a reference to the star card in the Tarot. So trying to layer these different symbols on top of each other, not in a way where I think it's a reference that we're getting the reference allows you to understand the work. It's more a way of strengthening and deepening a symbol. So you don't have to see the reference and know it to have it do its thing, right? It's deployed in the world. Any questions before I move on? And I assume we're getting pretty far into time, so.
15.
Okay.
My question is since he survived,
Yeah.
it sounds like it's almost as that the specter's purpose wasn't to kill the artist, just to kill its creations. So it's more like you can create, but create the things I want you to create, not the things that you want to create.
I mean, I think that's a great read of it. Again, I think when we're talking about creativity and its shadow, I tend to view a lot of the conflicts in my work rather than as distinct characters vying for control within a plot as aspects of one thing. So in Painter's Judgment, when we saw Painter hanging upside down and the king and the specter, I kind of saw that as a portrait of one person, if that makes sense. So it's the creative process encapsulated through multiple characters. But again, by no means do I feel like I can exhaust the meaning of these things by telling you what I think they mean. So if you have a thought about this, chase that thought. That's what I'm trying to do for people. I had at the opening, people come up after they talk to me and they'd be like, oh, thank you so much for explaining it. My ideas about this were totally wrong, but now I understand. I'm like, no. You should be able to bring your own interpretation, and hopefully what I'm saying just enriches what you're bringing to the work as well.
I've got a few questions.
Yes, please.
All right, so one from someone online. How do you maintain consistency when recreating older paintings within works? What prompted the introduction of making references to the past as a theme, which I think is the more interesting one?
Yeah, so in terms of consistency, that one's easy. I will either print and cut out pictures of my old paintings and then put them in perspective on little so this one I had little pieces of cardboard that I cut up. This whole area is just a bunch of cut up cardboard, and I was gluing images of old paintings down so I could get them in perspective. So the technical thing is actually pretty decently easy once you kind of get a methodical way of working through it. As far as what brought about references to old works, I think it's because when I first started making the Border Creature mythology, it felt like this huge, big abstract way of talking about life where it's I'm not just talking about going for a walk in the woods, I'm talking about nature, right? Capital N, nature, right? And mankind and nature, all these big dramatic themes. And, to a certain extent, I still think about these things. I think about big ideas, but there is a personal element to any artist's practice where the further in you go, the more self-reflective you tend to be. And at a certain point, after including Painter enough times and realizing Painter needed to make something to be Painter, I kind of realized Painter was going to be making this work in the world. So I imagine that there's a corner of the woods somewhere in the borderlands where you could go view this exhibition and just be propped up against trees. And Painter makes works that I don't make as well. I think the abstract works are a good example of that. Painter has a more eclectic style than I do. Painter experiments more than I do. But because of that, because I'm working with the character of Painter, I have to experiment more. So it's a way of allowing the narrative and the myth making to give me a space to reflect on my own process and my own work, but then also creating this space where I get to be an artist that is not myself, and explore what that is like as well. It's like a mask, I guess.
I got another one.
Yeah.
Is the portal to another world a prelude of works to come?
That's a complicated answer. I mean, what I'll say is that Painter has gained the ability to open these portals. Painter's portals look different than other people's portals. So let's actually, as I'm answering this question, move to another portal painting. So this is another portal painting. This one's called Sky Song. You'll immediately see the kinds of portals that Border Creatures open, they vary, right? Thus far, there's been a lot of skies that these open up onto, but they're not limited to that, right? So with Painter's portal, that image was made in a cardboard box that I cut into an archway, and then I created a layered abstraction out of colored construction paper, and then lit it with colored lights from different angles to create shadows, and it created this highly stylized abstract space. And it made sense to me that if Painter was having their world expand, having their creative imaginal world open up, that it wouldn't necessarily look like everyone else's, right? So Painter gets a very special window. And so those are definitely hinting at things that we're going to see from Painter. I mean, Painter's not done opening these portals. That's what Border Creatures do right now. And as far as this image, this is a collaborative bit of music getting played by Glow Gardner, who is the musician of the Border Creatures, and Big Thinker, who is usually a philosopher but has been relegated to percussion in this work. So a lot of times these portals tend to get opened through creative collaboration, right? Again, this idea of creativity connecting to others. I think as a painter, I probably worry about this more than other artists do, because there's such a tendency to self-isolation in the studio, right? All of these works take forever to make, and I hole myself up in my studio and I labor over them for hours and hours and hours and hours. And it's an active process to make sure that I am remaining connected to my life in a way that allows these things to grow. Right? It's easy to fall into the trap of Painter's Tower and wall oneself off from the world. But in this instance, collaboration is this direct path to opening this window into the imaginal world that makes the Borderlands bigger. Right? Again, not an escape hatch, but a window. Any other questions? Okay. So we're probably at an hour, right?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So I am going to talk about one more painting, I think. Again, while I would love to go through every single work in the show, I am a long-winded person, so I'm not going to have time to do that. So if you have not looked at the exhibition online, I encourage you to go look at the works a little more closely. And for those of you in person,
I've got a good question from
go
our
for
friend Caitlin. While there's a conflict in the narrative, the images also evoke a sense of idyllic utopia for me. Were you thinking about utopia when painting these?
I was thinking about Arcadia. But yes, I mean, essentially, yes. The specters didn't always exist in this work. When I first started making this work, it was just Border Creatures living their best life, having tea parties and having discussions about philosophy and making paintings and going for walks in the woods. And the way I thought about it was a term I would use is an Arcadia for the other, right? It's the border creatures. They're off-putting physically, right? They have this alien quality to them. They are other, but there is this deep sensitivity to them that invites empathy. And you know, I guess when Sherry read my bio and talked about how I draw on my experience of growing up in a closeted queer family, I think, you know, again, I don't think I'm allegorizing my experience in the work, but I think it fed into the reasons that I've made the creative choice to build the world in the way that I have. So for some context, I have a transgender mother, and my mother's and my brother and I grew up in the Deep South in Georgia, and we lived in a closeted family. So it was a kind of kept secret where we had this narrative that we would tell, and from a very young age, my brother and I like trained to make sure we had this thing down so that people wouldn't be guessing. And we had a false heteronormative face that we'd present, but then we'd come back home and it would be this little cabin in the woods on a lake where I grew up. And I think Arcadia for the other, that notion, that probably just comes from my childhood. You know, we are a product of our making. So, you know, growing up there, it was this sense of you come home, you're in the woods, it's like you be natural, right? You don't need a story, you don't need a facade. So yes, there is a sense of what is being protected from the specters when the border creatures are trying to enact these rituals to enrich the borderlands and to save the borderlands. What's being protected is this Arcadia for the other. And again, it's not an allegory. I'm not saying this is like a direct parallel to things in the real world. It's a symbol, which is to say that's one way of approaching it, and I think one that's a little more biographical, if that makes sense.
Someone's asking, are the creatures from the show called Last of Us?
What is Last of Us?
I have not seen Last of Us,
No.
but it's a zombie film.
Oh, okay.
Or, no, not film. It was a video game.
Tell them how long you've been painting these creatures.
I've been doing these things since...
Way before.
Yeah, I painted the first border creature in 2011, which I don't know when Last of Us, the video game, was released, but I've never owned a gaming system, so this is one of those things where I get these questions about, like, your work reminds me of Annihilation or whatever, and it's like, ideas are like that, symbols are like that, they exist, and like, when people are trying to pluck an idea for what otherness looks like, which that's what a zombie film or a zombie game or a zombie show is you're plucking an idea of otherness from the field of symbols and images. Like, yeah, you're probably going to be drawing on similar things to someone else who's using it in a way to talk about otherness as a thing that invites empathy, right? Like, it's different approaches to the same kinds of image sets. So, you know, I'm looking at flora and fauna and fungi and all this, and of course the show designers, or the designers for the show were as well. But no, I've not seen it. I am aware of it. And yeah, I mean, like, images are like that, you know? People draw on the same source without necessarily having the same conversation.
Let's go to the last painting.
Sorry. I wonder if Painter suspects somehow that vulnerability is gonna lead him to, because in that painting, when you describe it, when you talk about it, I thought, okay, oh, he's walled up, like a bad thing. But then when I saw that one, the way he seems like he's willingly, like, accepting his fate, made me think that he's not completely closed, like, he is walled up, but there is still some space to be invaded. And
Yeah.
I wonder if he kind of, like, not likes it, but like surrenders to, or there's a notion that it is coming and it's gonna be okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so the question for, I don't know if the people on Instagram could hear that one, so I'll kind of paraphrase it if that's all right. So the question is essentially the movement from Painter's Tower to Painter's Judgment, right? So in Painter's Tower, Painter is in the studio, isolated, yes, but here come the specters, and there's going to be this radical opening of Painter's world, right? Through trauma. But when we get to Painter's judgment, there is a sense of surrender and acceptance. So does Painter at this point have a notion of what's coming, and are they open to it? I would say yes, in as much as Painter is an artist and not, I think artists, it's a cycle. Sometimes you're in this space, sometimes you're walled off. I've been here many, many, many times. Like even in the making of this show, I've been here. And it's a process of allowing yourself that vulnerability and reminding yourself that it is important to the process. So yes, in a sense of the greater meaning in terms of plot, I don't know. I don't always have access to the inner worlds of these characters and what their thoughts are. And sometimes I think they're thinking one thing and then that changes. But in as much as Painter is an analog for myself, yes, because I don't view that narrative cycle as a linear progression. It's a cycle, right? You move from the snake that's connecting two people back to the Ouroboros, right? And then from there, you have to shed your skin, open up again. It's a process that you're constantly kind of moving through as a creative person. Or, again, I want to say, in terms of creativity, I've been talking as if I'm just talking about artists, but I'm not. So when I talk about creativity is something that everyone has access to. Creativity is just part of the nature of life. So when I say creativity, I mean creativity in the sense that creativity is a sequel to being. It's something that is, you live, therefore you are creative, right? So this is a thing that I think about because I'm an artist, and creativity is my way of life, but everyone is engaging with how to live a creative life all the time. So I don't want to just isolate it to conversations about art making as well.
Thank you.
Anything else you want to look at before we go?
Yeah, let's do one very quick painting. I'll be brief on this one. I want to touch on this one. So I know that I've been speaking for a while, so to those of you in person and to those of you online, thank you for your patience. I'll keep this brief, but I wanted to end with this one because I've been speaking about these big, heavy, broad ideas, and I want to ground it in something very simple. This was one of the first images that I made for this painting, or for this exhibition. I think this was the first or second painting that I made for it. And rather than beginning this show with Painter's Tower or one of the other ones that had this intricate mesh of symbols, I wanted to start with something that felt true and direct. And this one, which is a lost spectral witness painting, Island is the subtitle to this one. This is one of I think this is Lost Spectral Witnesses 20, which is the progression of the lost spectral witnesses is a movement towards connection, right? They're lost because they're isolated, they're alienated. They don't know how they exist in the world, they don't know how to talk to each other. As they move through the lost spectral witnesses paintings, they begin to find the path, and the path is connection, it's connection with others. This is a painting of love. I mean, that's it. I completed this one about a month after I got married. My wife is holding the phone, and thank you for holding it during the stream. But I painted this after getting married, and I wanted to create something that was very direct and would speak without need of explanation. So when I say I'm not going to say a ton about this painting, I mean that. I think this painting speaks directly about love. And that's at the heart of all of this. So I think maybe that's a good place to end it, unless there are any final questions before we wrap up.
I have some randos online asking if you're going to do a comic book or a tarot deck.
Yes, so what I'll say about that is I entertain thoughts of things that aren't paintings all the time, and one of these days I will absolutely rigorously pursue that, be that a oracle card deck or a comic book or some other thing. I mean, I don't know, but these paintings take so much time and attention, as you can only imagine. I spend a lot of time in my studio. So, yes, I have an interest in doing those sorts of things. Do I have a timeline or a clear idea of when that could happen? No, not at all. But I dream about it all the time in a world when I had about 100 more hours every week to work and still have some leisure time. But as it is, you know, that's in the nascent stages of brainstorming at the very most.
I'm getting another question. Do your creatures ever lose their light or glow?
No.
No.
That has not happened thus far. I mean, again, this story is always evolving. And I think sometimes people think I have this clear picture mapped out of everything from the beginning of this world to the end of this world. And that's not how I work. I work through symbols primarily. So a lot of times a set of symbols will kind of come up, and then I'll craft a plot around that. But this is a ship I'm building as I'm sailing it. I think of myself as another explorer of the Borderlands. I'm shining lights into little corners to see what's there, but I don't know what every single corner is. It's not all mapped out. And that's how I keep my practice alive and exciting for myself, is being able to discover new things that I didn't expect to discover. Anything else? Okay, well, in that case, thank you everyone who's been watching online. Thank you everyone who's come in person. It really means a lot to me to be able to spend the final day of this exhibition speaking from the heart about this work. Completing the show has meant a lot to me, and it means a lot to me to be able to share it with you. So thank you for coming out.
Thank you, Adrian.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Sorry for shaking you guys. Bye. All right.